Welcome into the Harvest, friends. We are here to bring you the confidence and clarity you need to be a disciple and make disciples in everyday places of life. I'm Abigail Wilson.
I'm Andrew Stroud.
I'm Lakeith Jones.
And on today's show, we are going to be talking about discipleship, but particularly the difference between informal and formal, more relational type of discipleship. So we're going to be looking at our experiences and what Scripture says about discipleship. So I think it's going to be a really great show. First, though, we have a couple of housekeeping announcements. Andrew, what do we have going on?
Well, we've been telling folks the last few weeks about a weekly email that we have called Harvest Highlights. And this is an email that goes out on Sundays, and it includes our best gleanings over the past week of resources, content that we've either created or that we've come across on the internet, or maybe that we've used for years in our personal ministry that we think would be most helpful to our community. And if you would like to get that, it's free. You can sign up for it over on our website, intotheharvest.org/newsletter. Just go to that site or click the link in the show notes or in the video description here for this video and enter your email, and you will get that email every Sunday. The other thing that we wanted to mention is that we have a YouTube channel. Some of you are watching this show on YouTube, but many of you listen to it on podcast. And so we just want to encourage, if you're listening to the show on the podcast, then make sure you check out the YouTube channel. We're going to be doing a lot of YouTube videos this year, not just this show, but conversations with other leaders and practitioners, disciple makers around the world that may not go onto the podcast, and definitely some shorter topical videos that won't go onto the podcast, where we do reviews or we cover specific topics that are shorter, like 5-7 minute videos. And we want our community to have access to all of those. So if you have not yet subscribed to the YouTube channel, then we encourage you to do a quick search for Into the Harvest and subscribe there. And also click on the bell, which makes you make sure that you get notified anytime we have a new video, whether it's this show or a topical video that we post. So yeah, if you're listening to this on podcast and you've not yet subscribed over on YouTube, then we encourage you to do that as well.
Is that it? Are those
That's
all
it.
of our announcements? Okay. All right, guys, let's get started. All right, so today's topic we decided a few weeks ago, but I think after the events of YouTube and Christianity that's been going on and circling all of our social media, the topic of Rhett and Link, who are the hosts of Good Mythical Morning, which is a huge YouTube show. They put out several long videos about their faith journey and how they ended up no longer following Jesus. And I think all of us, we were just talking about it offline, we're pretty sad about the whole thing. But I think really this topic now became even more important to all three of us. Discipleship can really be a huge key in getting through the long haul as a believer and ending just as strong as we start. So we all have pretty long and extended opinions and experiences with discipleship. But I think anyone who's just starting out quickly starts to think, okay, now how do we do this whole discipleship thing? So we tend to kind of see people go at it either in a very formal and traditional, maybe is a good word, way of handling it within a church setting and very structured, or a very informal sort of relational method. So we're going to put people in the box here maybe a little bit by putting those two titles on it, but maybe we can just clarify a little more as we go. So just hang with us. But we'll just start by talking about our own experiences. So guys, why don't we start with you guys? Just share some of your personal experience with discipleship and what that has looked like for you.
Yeah, I think for me, discipleship was relatively new to me, something that came about in my 20s. It's not something that I grew up with or was familiar even with the term a disciple or discipleship. I knew it existed, but I didn't know that was something that believers really participated in. It sounded like almost like a foreign concept. So when I first got involved, just with faith in general. There was a young man, Darian Durr, who was on my ship, who took me under his wing and really walked me through the Bible. I think that was my first exposure to discipleship, and that it was all right to have someone walk with you through faith. So most of the guys, even for military guys, when they want to get in shape, what they'll do is hire a personal trainer, or they'll have them free at the gym. And it's just someone a little further along than you that can help you get to that next step. And even the big tough guys, they can admit that that was okay. So I think spiritually coming to terms with the fact that we needed someone individually to walk with us through the journey to help us get to that next step was good, and it was important. And often in Jesus's ministry, you see that happen a lot with discipleship, where he was walking his guys and helping them get to the next step, but encouraging them to do that after he was gone. So I love this topic. I think it's really important, but I still think it's a bit underrated. Like, it's still under the radar.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Obviously, the three of us are passionate about disciple making. We've committed our lives to it. We've benefited from it, having others invest in us and teaching us the faith and showing us how to walk with God and live it out. But we're standing here 2,000 years removed from Jesus's great commission to his disciples to go therefore and make disciples of all nation. And the church over the years has embraced that mission to different degrees, and they've gone about it in different ways. And some of the way that we see the church going about making disciples today is more formalized. It's sort of something that's developed over years and centuries of trying to carry out this mission of Jesus, to represent him and to pass on to the faith to the next generation. And then I think each of us has probably also been highly influenced by a more informal approach, a more relational approach, where an older believer has taken an interest in us personally and begun to share their life with you. So, you mentioned Durr on the ship, Lakeith. How did that look? If you could just give like maybe a story that illustrates like how that relationship got started.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the ship every night did nightly prayer, and I was pretty ashamed to pray out loud with all of the rescue swimmers. It was just not something that we did. So when I wanted to pray, I would walk out of the work center and I would pray with the ship. And one night I was in my bed, rack in the Navy. It's a small bed. It's terrible. But the night prayer came on then. It was a little late, so I decided to pray in my bed. And someone seen me, I got busted. And it was Darian Durr. And he asked me about if I knew what I was praying, if I knew about Jesus, about the Bible. I think at that moment I realized I knew about Jesus, but I didn't know Jesus, And it was helpful to have someone to dig a little deeper, to not be afraid to push through and ask me piercing questions that forced me to come with terms that I didn't know Jesus. So he helped me, I would say, after that, get to know who Jesus was.
Yeah, I think, Keith, that really kind of makes it distinguish very clear to me, because that was a personal experience that you had with him. He listened to where you were spiritually and then asked you questions kind of according to where you were spiritually. Like, he started asking you the questions that you needed to start figuring out the answers to. I think growing up in a church where I think discipleship looked like sitting in church every week and listening to the pastor and then interpreting that for myself into how that could fit in my life. And then also watching my parents and other believers in the church just from afar and kind of mirroring my life after them. But I don't really remember any strong questioning or any kind of clear personal direction of like, Abigail, you should do this because I see you doing this, or have you thought about doing this, or are you doing this? Like, none of those types of things are happening. It was very much discipleship was personal. So I was watching other people be disciples of Jesus in their personal life. And it was left up to me to decide if I too wanted to be a personal disciple of Jesus. It wasn't until I was pretty much engaged to Brett and I went to a navigators conference which the Navigators are very much known for discipleship and like personal discipleship. So this is where we kind of get into informal versus formal. So before that was definitely formal. And I was super shocked. People I did not know came up to me and asked me, so what are you getting out of your quiet time? And my response was, I don't know you. Like, how dare you? Like, I don't know you, person. Why are you asking me such a personal question? So it actually took me a minute as someone who is already following Jesus to really transition from realizing that being a disciple even could be something that I invited other people into, and that I could really learn from someone who is ahead of me in a really personal way, that they would interact with me about my faith and I would answer questions about how I was doing, really personal questions sometimes, and that I could really have a very interactive discipleship relationship. So that was kind of what it looked like. And so seeing both sides, I'm not saying one is better than the other, but they definitely teach in different ways. Okay, so let's maybe move into our second sort of question for you guys. In as far as Jesus modeling being a disciple of the Father and then him making disciples, what do we see in Scripture that might speak to either this more formal picture that we talked about, or maybe this more personal, informal version? So what do we see in Scripture?
So we have a conviction that Jesus is the ultimate disciple maker. He's the source, but more than that, that he's actually our blueprint. That I think the three of us would say that we don't just see Jesus as someone that we're admiring from a distance, and that we aren't supposed to follow his example, not just in his character and in his devotion to the Father, but in the way he went about living and sharing his life, the way he went about making disciples. The three of us would say that Jesus is our model for making disciples. And so we wanted to really address this question when it comes to formal and informal approaches to disciple making. What do we see from the ministry of Jesus himself? Like, what are some examples of Jesus doing more structured or formal approaches? And so things that come to my mind are, Jesus, he did go to the feasts. He did operate within the synagogue structure. He would go from town to town, and he would participate in those more formal meetings and more formal feasts. So for sure, there was a sense in which Jesus was taking advantage of the formal structures that were there within his society and his culture to connect with people. But he went so much beyond that in terms of how he went about making disciples. And obviously he personally sought out and called individuals, kind of like what you were referencing there, Abigail. One of my favorite verses on this is from John chapter 1. And it says that Jesus had already met the first few disciples. He had met Andrew and probably John. John isn't mentioned by name, but probably John, and then Peter. And so at least those three had begun to follow Jesus. And it says that the next day Jesus decided or purposed to go into Galilee, and he found Philip, and he called to him, "Follow me." And so you see Jesus being very intentional to go to a certain location and to seek out a certain person, Philip, but then and to give him a very clear call, "Follow me." But it was in the context of a one-on-one personal relationship. So that's one example that I was thinking of when I was thinking about Jesus's formal and informal approaches to discipleship. But there's a ton of them. So were there some that stood out to you guys as you were thinking about this?
Yeah, I got to call back to, if you guys have been following the podcast for a while, I remember in season 1 when we would try to nail it down to one verse, Abigail would always choose more than one verse. So I got to pull an Abby right here. I think of Luke chapter 5 when Jesus was teaching by the lake, and it says that this huge crowd was gathering around him, and he's teaching all of these people. And you would think that this was it. It's kind of formal because the acoustics are great. Like, there's a great crowd. They want to hear what he's saying. But he looks over at these two fishermen, and they're finishing up for the night. They're done. They've spent their whole night fishing, haven't caught anything, but he tells them to put out their net for a catch. And what was cool is that despite Peter's maybe frustrations or his him being hesitant, he obeyed. He told Jesus that, hey, at your word, I'll do it, even though it didn't seem like he wanted to. And he did, and obviously he enclosed a large number of fish. And what was cool is that Jesus went from his master to his Lord. Like, there was a lot of people around that maybe knew Jesus as a great teacher, as master, but Peter obeyed him in that moment, and Jesus became his Lord. And he told them, hey, they left their nets, followed everything. They followed him. But it was cool because he said, from now on, you're going to be fishing for men or fishing for people. And in that moment, he was fishing for them. I think it's so cool that he modeled this, hey, very informal, like he was teaching. And I don't even think they were paying attention because they're washing their nets, but he chose them as individuals to to follow him. And I think it was really, really neat that even in that very formal setting, he was still aiming for individuals and seeking to impact those guys.
Yeah, I think it may be important for us to clarify by formal and informal. I don't know if some of our listeners might still be a little fuzzy on what we really mean by that. Maybe they're not, but so if you guys feel like we've covered that pretty clearly, then that's fine. We can just quickly, tell me that we're gonna move on from this. But what I think about when I see what the church is doing today, and the pathway, I guess you could say, how we're trying to go about helping people come to faith and then grow to maturity, it's so different from what you see in the scriptures and certainly from what you see in Jesus. And so I'm thinking of the more traditional church that and Keith, you experienced this. I know that, and we've seen so many people experience this, that when they really become serious about their faith, there can be an assumption that, well, I need to go to Bible college, I need to go to seminary, and I need to become a pastor or become some sort of official religious person, which is a very formal approach or formal pathway to disciple making. And Abigail, it sounded like for you it was similar as it was for me growing up in the Bible Belt, that there really wasn't an informal pathway, like an alternative apprenticeship approach. And yet I think that's what you see in Jesus. He seems to operate out of a more often than not, it's an informal approach to disciple making.
I mean, we see in his disciples that he chose fishermen and tax collectors, who's maybe the most educated, but I don't know. I mean, Matthew could add and subtract, but we don't know what else is going on with him. They all had the minimum for Jewish boys at the time, which is probably more than our kids today, but that's another story. So, but I think the bottom line is that they weren't the super educated, and they weren't the ones who had clearly been chosen to be in the track to be a rabbi. So it wasn't like they were super smart. I think that can just be encouraging for all of us. As also followers of Jesus, also as disciples of Jesus, that we too can be disciple makers. And so I think as much as maybe we've covered a lot of how to be discipled and the different ways that one can be discipled so far, I think we also can just be encouraged that if we're spending time with Jesus ourselves, whatever we gain from Jesus, we can pass on to someone else about Jesus. It's really kind of cool. But just this week, I had a friend ask, because she kept being asked by people she was discipling, what are the criteria to disciple someone else? And my criteria is always, are you one step ahead of them? Then you can disciple them. And honestly, if they catch up to you, then you can just do it together and be partners. But I think a lot of times we do have that mentality that we do have to go off and get a full-blown education and in order to disciple others. And that may stem from that formal discipleship that we've seen. So for instance, in my story earlier, if I had just taken what I had seen, the only way for me to impact someone else was for me to, I guess, teach Sunday school, because I'm also a girl, so I wasn't going to be preaching in that particular church. So I think for me, I was seeing the only way to impact someone else's life was to be a teacher, for one, And it definitely didn't look very personal. And so I was going to need probably more education or just a lot more experience, a lot more knowledge of scripture. They all had like, just infinite years behind them, it felt like, that showed so much wisdom. So I think being able to pull back the curtain a little bit for us and saying like, we're not that special, like you can do this too, is really important for us to be more like Jesus in this situation. He was Jesus, so we're never going to be that good, but we can we can at least mirror the way he was impacting the world. My favorite kind of example that I was just reading in Mark this week is just how Jesus would share parables with the masses, and then his followers would ask him questions. And so privately, he would go deeper with them. So even if we are kind of maybe meshing that formal picture with the more informal, I just tripped over my words. Even if we're doing that, we can kind of use that formal environment to hit, maybe a larger section of people, but we are taking it into an informal setting of just living life with people, sharing in their lives. If they invite us into that, then that is really the best way to be discipled. So yeah, I just rambled for a while there. Let's any thoughts on that before we move on? I'm sure I said way too much.
No, I did have a few thoughts. One is there are some strengths, I think, to both. There are some strengths to having a more formal approach. The one that came to my mind was that you can make sure that major topics get covered. Mm-hmm. So typically, if you have a more structured, formal approach to disciple making, then you're thinking ahead and you're thinking through what are the big pieces. And we have some formal things that we do. We have some curriculum that we take young disciples through, and it's available on the website at End of the Harvest. So we use the Foundation series. That's a very formal approach. So it's not that we're saying that you should either do formal or informal. It really does need to be a blend, and I think Jesus had a blend. We operate with a blend. One of the advantages of formal disciple making is that you're thinking ahead and you're trying to make sure that the main pieces are covered. But one of the advantages of informal is that it's more true to life, and so you're actually finding out what the other person is really struggling with, because you may be covering a very important, genuine, legitimate topic in your formal program of discipleship or in your curriculum, but the person you're discipling may be struggling in a totally different area. And the informal approach really allows you to have that kind of interaction and those kind of conversations like you mentioned Jesus having with his disciples, Abigail.
Yeah, and I think, that's a great example. And we've talked about this before. You don't even have to be that with it and together and thinking ahead, because we do have awesome resources like that foundation study. So you can just print it out yourself and read it with them. We're not even making you think that hard. So the good news is that we do have so many generations before us and so much material that we can steal, so to speak, from each other in that. So we really don't have to just have it all together ourselves, I guess. Keith, would you say that this approach of formal and informal, how does it look in your own personal ministry?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think maybe one of the things I can talk about is just the genesis of it, like ministry in an individual's life. For the informal folks, like we do a Bible study on Tuesday nights at 32nd Street, and most of the individuals we bump into are when they're eating at the galley, or they're bowling, or they're just going through everyday life, and it's our mission to try to engage them in a natural way, but also to extend the invitation of the good news of the gospel of a community that wants to help them grow in their faith. So it's a very informal approach, I would say, to ministry, because we're not online and reaching out and broadcasting this awesome Bible study where people are dropping their emails and they're just swinging by, but we're getting up almost cold turkey and just talking to them about faith and about their background. And some people are very open to it, and literally had people run away at times. So you never know what you're going to get. So I do think that the informal approach can be sometimes more challenging because you don't know what to expect. You never know where a person's at. So the results may vary, but I would say it's very worth it because I was informally invited out to a Bible study. Guy on the beach approached me with a cool hat, and I was inquiring about his hat, and he was inquiring about my my everything, But thank God he did, because he had the boldness to invite me out to the study, and it was from there where I really, grew in my faith. So I am pro informal, I am pro formal, but right now I think for us what works the best right now is an informal approach, because there's a lot of people who wouldn't be engaged otherwise if we weren't willing to get out there and to rub shoulders with them in everyday life.
Yeah, we're fans of all. I was thinking that there's really, maybe when it comes to disciple making and the church, I really see three big categories. One is it's just missing. In some of our churches, there's no intentional approach to disciple making, and it's just built around. There's a Sunday service. There may or may not be faithful teaching of God's word, but then that's it. There's nothing beyond that is targeted towards purposely trying to help the people who show up on Sunday to become genuine disciples. It's just a Sunday service. And then I would say the second approach is that we can start to develop more formal ways of trying to offer more in-depth discipling growth opportunities. So whether that's a Bible study or a life group or a discipleship program, and a lot of churches will have begun to do that. The third is the more informal relational approach that we are all huge fans of and that we see in the life of Jesus. That the primary way that Jesus, if you think of the people that were impacted by Jesus, the people that were left after he returned, like where were the 5,000 that he fed after he ascended back into heaven? We don't see them.
They gone.
Yeah. So the people who were really changed for life from Jesus's ministry were the ones that he spent the most time with informally, traveling the roads between the cities, answering those questions, Abigail, after the parables, getting rebuked because they were always blowing it, forgetting to bring bread or contradicting Jesus in his mission. Those are the stories that we're so familiar with in the Gospels. Most of those are examples of Jesus's informal ministry, the informal interactions that he had, not just with the disciples, but even with other individuals that he happened upon, people who needed to be healed. Those interactions that he had that were not programmed into his daily, weekly schedule as a formal plan of disciple making, but that he just stumbled across in the course of his life and was willing and available to share with them. Don't know where I was going with that, but
that was good.
Oh man,
really
it was
thoughts.
good. It was great. Unfortunately, guys, we are coming to the end of our time, but I do want to just shift it over to you listening. If you have any questions or thoughts about today's episode, we definitely want you to leave us a comment. We want to hear, maybe as you were listening, have you been more informally or formally discipled yourself? What are you doing as you're discipling others? What does that look like for you? We would love to hear about all of it and how that's going. And we definitely will be coming back to this type of topic again. So don't worry. This is an ongoing thing on our show. So thank you again for listening. As always, it was tons of fun, and we hope that you will share this with somebody you know. We'll talk to you later. Bye, guys.
Bye, Abby.
Yeah.